Members of the BRICS nations, which is a coalition of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, have had enough of the negative policies of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank.
We have to reform global economic, financial and political, as well as the multilateral trading system.
They agree that the monetary organizations are unfair to the global south, and many developing nations agree. As the BRICS nations get ready for their next summit, challenging the IMF and the World Bank would be the top issue they would be tackling. The consequences would be serious, as it would snowball to affect the US dollar and Western influence on the global economy. Hi, my name is Ernar, and today we will try to understand how legitimate are their concerns about the IMF, and could this be the beginning of the end for these organizations. So make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. So one of the key issues for the BRICS nations is the unfair voting quota the IMF uses. The IMF voting share system is the stark reminder of the organization's outdated and biased governance structure. The current setup is a relic of the post-World War II era, where the United States and its allies held significant economic and political sway. Today, this system perpetuates a grossly unfair distribution of power, leaving the most nations with minimal influence. To address the growing criticism from developing nations, the IMF in October 2023 announced that they would be increasing Africa's seat on the executive board from 2 to 3.
The International Monetary Fund says a seat on its executive board will give countries in sub-Saharan Africa a louder voice. In a similar move, the World Bank is also set to give a seat to African countries on its board.
While the mainstream media is lapping on this news, the truth is it doesn't make much difference, if any at all. Africa has 54 countries recognized by the United Nations. Having 3 seats doesn't change much in terms of representation, and Africa remains the least represented continent. This loop-sided representation is also seen in Asia and South America, while North America and Western Europe alone hold 11 seats, leaving the rest of the world to share 13 seats. But the real power is not even in the executive seats, it's in what is called the voting share. Top 5 economies, the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom and France, wield an astonishing 38% of the total votes. By comparison, Africa, a continent comprising of 54 countries and over 1.3 billion people, holds a partly 5.4% of the total voting power in the International Monetary Fund. Such a little share is a stark reflection of the continent's historical marginalized position in the global economic governance. To put this into perspective, the entire African continent has fewer votes than individual countries like Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Even the United States alone holds more than 5 times the voting power of all African countries combined. This gross underrepresentation means that Africa's voice is barely audible in the critical IMF decisions, despite the continent's growing economic significance. The consequences of this voting disparity are far-reaching. Africa's limited influence hampers its ability to shape policies that directly impact its economies, currencies, and development trajectories. When the IMF makes decisions on issues like debt relief, economic stabilization, or crisis response, Africa's interests are often relegated to the sidelines. Furthermore, this power imbalance perpetuates a cycle of dependency, where African countries are forced to conform to policies dictated by more powerful nations. This undermines their sovereignty and ability to pursue independent economic strategies tailored to their unique needs and context. The IMF has long played lip service to resolving this imbalance, claiming the process is complex and may take many years.
Of course, this is a process that will take time. It will not happen overnight. We are reforming an organization that is complex, sophisticated, and reaching every corner of the world economy.
Even the United States, which has historically been resistant to changes, has recently shown a willingness to consider reforms. However, the road to reform is long and arduous, requiring cooperation and consensus among member countries. The IMF's governance structure is a complex web of interest, and untangling it will demand sustained effort and commitment. Different countries are opposing the IMF and World Bank policies in different ways, and based on socio-economic consequences suffers from dealing with the international monetary organizations. One of the countries that has been having problems with the IMF and the World Bank is Venezuela. As you probably know, Venezuela is a country in severe economic distress. The country's leadership has long viewed the IMF and World Bank as an instrument of foreign intervention rather than neutral financial institutions. The tensions date back to the 1980s, when Venezuela was forced to implement austerity measures dictated by the IMF in exchange for loans. This led to the widespread poverty and inequality, fueling resentment towards the IMF. In 2007, President Hugo Chavez famously withdrew Venezuela from the IMF and World Bank, calling them instrument of domination. However, in 2019, Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, sought IMF assistance amidst a severe economic crisis. But the IMF refused, citing concern over Venezuela's debt sustainability and lack of transparency. Maduro accused the IMF of bowing to US pressure aimed at ousting him. In 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 epidemic, Venezuela requested help from IMF again. And guess what? They were denied. The conditions the IMF gave the Venezuelan government to the loan to be approved was that the government implement harsh austerity measures. Maduro rejected the offer, calling it poisoned gift. The situation worsened in 2022 when the IMF published a report criticizing Venezuela's economic management and calling for regime change. Maduro responded by expelling the IMF representative from the country, accusing the organization of meddling in Venezuela's internal affairs. Throughout the ordeal, Venezuela has sought alternative sources of funding such as China and Russia to reduce its dependence on the IMF. However, this has only led to the further accusation of authoritarianism and lack of transparency. In 2023, the country announced its intentions to join the BRICS nations, which would make it the second Latin American country in the economic bloc after Brazil. Another country that has suffered from unfavorable IMF policies is Nigeria. The country has had a long history of borrowing from the IMF, dating back to the 1980s. But this has often come with stringent conditions that have been criticized for worsening Nigeria's economic situation. One of the most notable instances was in 1986, when the government of General Ibrahim Babangida negotiated a loan deal with IMF that required the country to implement a structural adjustment program, SAP. The SAP led to the widespread privatization, deregulation, and cuts in government spending, which has devastating effects on the Nigerian economy. The program was widely criticized for increasing poverty and inequality, and for benefiting foreign corporations at the expense of Nigerian businesses. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Nigeria continued to borrow from the IMF, but the country's debt burden grew exponentially. By 2005, Nigeria owed the IMF and the other foreign creditors over $30 billion. This led to a major debt relief campaign led by the Nigerian government and civil society organizations, which culminated in the Paris Club agreeing to write off $18 billion of Nigerian debt in 2005. However, the IMF continued to exert significant influence over Nigeria's economic policies, often pushing for policies that benefited foreign investors at the expense of Nigerian citizens. In 2017, the IMF approved a $1.5 billion loan to Nigeria, but only on the condition that the government implement a range of austerity measures, including increasing the value-added tax rate and removing fuel subsidies. Many Nigerians saw this as an attempt by the IMF to impose its economic agenda on the country, without regard of the needs and priorities of Nigerian citizens. The government's decision to accept the loan and implement the IMF condition sparked widespread criticism and protest, with many arguing that the IMF was perpetuating a cycle of debt and dependency. Femi Falana, a fiery human rights lawyer and activist, has long been a thorn in the side of the International Monetary Fund and its policies in Nigeria. He has consistently cautioned the Nigerian government to be wary of the IMF sweet-talking loan offers, warning that they come with strings attached that can strangle the country's economy. The activist argues that the organization's policies have perpetuated poverty and inequality in Nigeria, with conditions that undermine the country's sovereignty and force it to dance to the tune of foreign creditors. He is particularly incensed by the IMF's emphasis on austerity measures such as slashing fuel subsidies and hiking taxes, which he believes are recipes for disaster, hitting the poor and vulnerable the hardest. Instead, Falana urges the Nigerian government to explore alternative sources of funding and economic partnerships, such as the BRICS nations. He sees the BRICS nations as a beacon of hope, offering a more equitable and sustainable model of economic development that prioritizes social welfare and national sovereignty over the interest of foreign creditors. He also advocates for stronger regional economic partnerships, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, to reduce dependence on foreign powers and fosters a sense of African solidarity. Not only African, but also European countries have similar criticism of the IMF and World Bank. For example, Greece. The trouble began in 2015, when Greece, grappling with a severe debt crisis, turned to the IMF for a bailout. However, the IMF conditions for the loan, including drastic austerity measures, sparked widespread outrage and resentment among the Greek people. Even the IMF leadership had to admit that their austerity policies made the situation in Greece worse. The austerity measures, which included steep cuts to the public spending, pensions reductions and tax hikes, led to the soaring unemployment, social unrest and a general sense of economic hardship. Many Greeks felt that the IMF's demands were draconian and disproportionately punished the most vulnerable segments of the society. The situation was further inflamed by the IMF's handling of the crisis, with some officials appearing to prioritize fiscal discipline over the economic growth and social welfare. Yanis Varoufakis, Greece's former finance minister, was a vocal critic of the IMF's policies, famously likening their approach to the fiscal waterboarding. Varoufakis argued that the IMF conditions were not only economically counterproductive, but also politically motivated, aimed at imposing a rigid ideological framework on the Greece rather than addressing the root causes of the crisis. He revealed that the Greece is torn between the choice of cutting of pensions and repaying the IMF instead.
If we can, on the 5th of June, repay the IMF and pay pensions and salaries, as well as the other obligations that we have to our internal creditors, we shall. If not, we will have to prioritize pensioners and public sector workers.
The tensions between Greece and the IMF came to the head in 2015 when Varoufakis resigned in protest over the IMF's refusal to budge on its demands. The standoff ultimately led to the chaotic summer of negotiations, which culminated in the third bailout packages worth $86 billion. However, the damage has already been done, with the Greece economy shrinking by a quarter and its people suffering throughout the years of economic hardship. In the years since, Greece has continued to struggling with the legacy of the IMF's bailout conditions, with many arguing that the country's economic recovery has been slow and uneven. The experience has left a deep scar on Greece's relationship with the IMF, with many Greeks viewing the organization as a part of the problem rather than the solution. The same issue is also observed in Asia, where many countries are facing challenges with the IMF. For example, Sri Lanka. In 2022, the island nation was facing an unprecedented economic crisis, with a severe shortage of foreign exchanges, fuel and essential medicines. Desperate for the lifeline, the government turned to the IMF for a bailout. However, the IMF's austerity measures, including tax hikes and spending cuts, sparked widespread outrage among opposition parties and the civil society groups. They argued that these measures would only exacerbate the economic hardships faced by ordinary Sri Lankans, who were already struggling to make ends meet. Critics accused the government of bowing down to the IMF, sacrificing the country's sovereignty in the process. They pointed to the fact that the IMF's condition would lead to increased prices, reduced subsidies, and a general decrease in the standard of living. One of the most vocal critics was the opposition leader Sajid Premedasa, who claimed that the government's decision to accept the IMF's condition was the betrayal of the people's trust. He argued that the measures would disproportionately affect the poor and vulnerable, who were already being the brunt of the economic crisis. The government, led by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, countered that the IMF support was necessary to stabilize the economy and restore investors' confidence. However, the damage has already been done, and the perception that IMF was a part of the problem rather than solution had taken hold. This perception was further reinforced by the fact that Sri Lanka had been down this road before. In 2019, the country secured a $1.5 billion IMF loan, which was conditional on implementing various reforms, including increasing taxes and reducing the budget deficit. However, the government had struggled to implement these reforms, leading a build-up of debt and a worsening of the economic crisis. Despite the criticism, the Sri Lankan government continued to engage with the IMF, securing $2.9 billion loan in March 2023. In the light of this entire situation, Brazil is sounding the alarm. The country believes that the way forward to implement comprehensive reforms in the International Monetary Fund. They are issuing a stark warning to the International Monetary Fund to give developing nations a greater voice, or risk becoming obsolete. As the IMF prepares for its upcoming meetings, Brazil's finance minister is urging drastic reforms to address the long-standing underrepresentation of emerging market countries. Tatiana Rusita, International Affairs Secretary, emphasized that the developing world is not waiting for a change. Instead, they are taking matters into their own hand, creating alternative institutions like the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to finance their growth. With President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva at the helm of the G20, Brazil is poised to amplify its push to reform. Finance Minister Fernanda Haddad carried their message to the IMF meeting in Marrakesh, stressing that the time for change is now. The IMF must adapt to the shifting global landscape, or face becoming increasingly irrelevant. Interestingly, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres agrees that these reforms must be made. So, will the IMF hit Brazil's call or risk losing its influence in the rapidly evolving world of international finance? Share your opinion in the comments below, and also don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos. See you in the next one. Bye bye.